A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Vertrauten Schabbat, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Convenes.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusas.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geber.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geber with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites. And before I get to the topic of this episode about emancipation, the Jewish people in modern times, and starting with the French Jewish community where emancipation starts and why it's important and what the story and development and the process was, I just want to make a few comments from letters from the listeners of Jewish History Soundbites. And recently I had a mini-series on Reb Aaron Kotler. So it was interesting that I pointed out that the Lakewood Yeshiva started in Beis Medrash Kaveh Yeshiva Lakewood started in White Plains, and I discussed Reb Nosson Wachtfeigel's role in that founding, and I got a couple of comments from listeners about how it was important that I pointed it out, and one even thanked me especially. But it turns out that that there was another figure involved. So I thought that I was taking to task the common knowledge that Reb Aaron Kotler was there from the beginning, and by pointing out that Reb Nosson Wachtfeigel was involved. But it turns out that it was actually someone else entirely who really started it, someone who I had never even heard of. I looked into after a listener pointed this out to me. So thank you for this knowledgeable and dedicated listener for helping out with this information. There was a fellow by the name of Reb Hillel Bishko from Williamsburg, who had a popular library of Jewish books that the yeshiva students at that time would use, and he wanted to open this kollel, and he opened it in White Plains, and he was the founder. And on the original letterhead of Beis Medrash Kavaya, it lists this Reb Hillel Bishko, who was involved in a lot of Jewish projects at that time. This was not his only initiative, both in Europe and then later on in the United States. A very active individual. And he founded Beis Medrash Kavaya, and he actually, the first Reish Kollel that he hired was the Lomza Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Chil Mordechai Gordon, an old Slobodka Talmud, Rosh Yeshiva of Lomza, was in America fundraising, and then ended up living there for many years, and was affiliated with the Lomza branch in Petach Tikva for a long time. A very interesting and fascinating individual. And Rabbi Chil Mordechai Gordon was nominated as the Reish Kollel. He was also on the letterhead for a period of time during the beginning. So this Reb Hillel Bishko was actually the founder of Chinuch Hatzmaya. Of Beis Medrash Kavaya in White Plains at that time, and eventually he brings Reb Aaron in, and then with the move to Lakewood, and then Reb Aaron took over at the leadership at the helm. Another correction I received was I related a story about how the way I said it over was that Reb Aaron had received a sum of money for officiating at a wedding, and when he was told that it's for his own personal use and not for the Lakewood Yeshiva, so he decided to donate it to Chinuch Hatzmai. And the correction I received was that it was actually with his son, Reb Shneir Kotler. And the sum was $2,000, a significant sum of money, and Reb Shneir decided not to keep it for himself, but since he thought it was for the Lakewood Yeshiva, but when he was told that it was for himself, he decided to donate it to Chinuch Atzmai. And, again, great people. So the story is said about Reb Aaron, it turns out Reb Schneier, it says a lot about both of them, the father and the son, about who they were. Okay. We'll take it. Other letters we'll save for another time because I want to get into the Emancipation. Emancipation. I give a lot of lectures lately, and I'm available for lectures and sponsorships for these episodes and stuff like that. So you could be in touch with me about all kinds of things: lectures, virtual tours, sponsorships. But one of the primary topics that both the audiences want to hear and what I enjoy it on is changes that swept over the Jewish people in the modern era. And all different types of changes, spiritual movements like Hasidim and the Yeshiva movement, and political movements like Zionism and other things, immigration to new countries, new horizons, new vistas, and things like emancipation and other changes like that, which kind of defines us, who we are today. And if there's one thing, probably more than anything else, that was a change in modern times for the Jewish people, it was emancipation. I would venture to say, if I dare do so, that emancipation is probably the most fundamental and greatest change that overcame the Jewish people in modern times, and something that we don't speak about enough. So this episode would just be an introductory episode. I hope to give more on it in the future, and if it's a topic that you like, you can be in touch with me about sponsorship. But the reason is because it's something that we take for granted today. Emancipation means citizenship, equal rights, voting, the right to vote, equality before the law, the equal right to education or opportunity in the business world. All these stuff that we take pretty much for granted in Western democracies, or Israel, which considers itself for some reason a Western democracy, or anything else. It's something that we really take for granted. And it's important to understand that how that developed, because it simply didn't exist until 200 years ago for anyone, especially not for the Jews. And the influence that it had on the development of the Jewish community, and the change in the structure of the Jewish community, and the far-reaching consequences of integration, acculturation, secularization. Again, things that we take for granted that exist within the Jewish world over the course of the 20th and now 21st century. The emancipation has had much more of an effect on integration, acculturation, and eventually secularization, or even possibly assimilation, much more than other movements such as the Haskalah, such as the Reform. We tend to give them much more credit than they deserve. But emancipation and what foreign governments, with sovereign, non-Jewish external forces, governments, and technology and industrial revolution, other things like that, definitely had much more of an effect on Jewish integration than any internal Jewish movement such as the Haskalah. So the emancipation begins in France, so we're going to focus on that this time. The French Revolution, with its value systems of liberty and equality and brotherhood and rationality, and getting rid of the old monarchist and religious based feudal system and all that, brings with it the Republicans, the Jacobians, all the movement within the French Revolution, and literally to overturn the world and its values, changed the way modern man and the Western culture started to look at the role of state, the role of the nation, and the role of the citizens, the people within the state, and the relation and obligations that they have to each other. So the revolution leads to a decision to grant emancipation, both to all the different classes within French non-Jewish society, And what comes to become a dominant feature of 19th century political life in Europe is that the Jewish minority, which again is pretty much the minority of Europe at that time, you do have Christian minorities. In Catholic countries, the Protestants are a minority. In Protestant countries, the Catholics are a minority. But in a sense, the Jews are always a certain outsider. And the measuring stick of revolutionary fervor in European nations of the 19th century, and the measuring stick of liberal policies, and the measuring stick of what type of government it is, especially with the rise of romanticism and nationalism towards the end of the 19th century, is the measure of emancipation that they give to its minority Jewish population. So the Jewish question becomes a huge question of the 19th century, and that, of course, explodes at the end of this, at the close of the century, a century after the revolution, in France once again, with the Dreyfus trial, because it becomes a political issue between the liberals and the conservatives within the society, with the liberals leading the pro-Dreyfus movement, because it becomes a symbol of what the values of the value system of the revolution is. And it starts right away. After the revolution, there's debates, for instance, about should we grant citizenship to the Jewish communities of Alsace-Lorraine, Strasbourg, which is areas which are always in between France and Germany. Is it German territory? Is it French territory? So the Jews who live there, are they really French? Maybe they're really German. And maybe we'll grant emancipation to the Jews of the Paris area or northern France, but maybe not to Alsace, maybe not to the Jews of Strasbourg. Maybe they're different. And this becomes a question. What makes someone different? What makes someone more French and less French? And then with the movement past the revolutionary era, when Napoleon's rise to power, the Jewish question arises once again. Napoleon, which is a fascinating story in itself, Napoleon convenes a Sanhedrin, the Grand Sanhedrin. And the Grand Sanhedrin is a very interesting proposal to have a bunch of Jewish, both laymen and rabbis, and all types of rabbis, traditional rabbis and reform rabbis. And there's the head of the Sanhedrin is a fellow by the name of Rabbi Yosef David Zinsheim, who is a traditional rabbi. Large percentage of the rabbis did come from Alsace, which was, the whole Strasbourg area was a much more traditional, or what we would call today Orthodox area. He wrote a sefer Yad David, which is, I think, only published recently. So he's the chairman of this supposed Sanhedrin, the Grand Sanhedrin, and Napoleon Napoleon's government submitted them 12 questions that they had to answer about mainly some of them were about internal Jewish questions, and mainly about the relation of the Jewish people to their non-Jewish neighbors, and especially vis-a-vis the government, the sovereign, the state. Perhaps the most important question that was submitted to the assembly was, do the Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens acknowledge France as their country? Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and follow the directions of the civil code? And the answer that the assembly gives is that the Jews in France have received emancipation and citizenship, equal rights. We're completely French. We speak French. This is 18 years after the revolution, even less of years after they've received citizenship. We're French, and they say an amazing line in there, and they're written. They summarize their written answers. An amazing line, and they say basically the summary of it is, the gist of it is that a French Jew, if he would be in England and he would be amongst English Jews, fellow Jews, he would feel less comfortable and less at home because he's not among Frenchmen. Whereas if he's in France, he's amongst his home and his people. And that's how they saw themselves, and that's definitely what they wanted to tell Napoleon and his government. And that's what emancipation was able to accomplish. So that's another stage. Now there's the post-Napoleon, with his sweeping across Europe. he brings different reforms in Germany, in Austria, in the countries of Europe. And there's this, once he's defeated after Waterloo, there's a regression. It goes backwards, especially in Germany. All the Napoleonic era reforms, go back and are rolled back, and the Jews across Europe have to wait quite a bit of time, especially in Germany, for emancipation. Of course, the majority of the Jewish people lives in Eastern Europe, and they don't receive emancipation till the Russian Revolution in 1917. But the Jews of Austria, the Galicia Jews, receive in 1867, and the German Jews receive also the last quarter of the 19th century. But if we go back to France, there's a rise of a very interesting individual, a fellow by the name of Adolphe Cremieux, and he becomes a major politician in 19th century France, and he's Jewish, and he comes to symbolize the success of the emancipation, the success of the revolution, of the integration of Jews into French society, and the way French Jews start to see themselves in as far as their role among the Jewish people, because Cremieux is one of the leaders. I mentioned this in the episode on the Damascus blood libel. He's the one who goes down. Also, Moses Montefiore from England in the 1840 Damascus blood libel to make it a international Jewish question and defending Jewish rights wherever they are. Cremieux is also part of, and this is an expression of the emancipation, is in 1860, the founding of the first international Jewish organization that sees the Jewish people as one entity, and that the Jews who have received emancipation and are in a better situation than a lot of their brethren around the world have a responsibility to them, and that organization is called the Alliance. The Alliance, in Hebrew, the Hebrew name of it is Kol Yisrael Chaverim, Kiach, and the Jews are responsible for one another. And we have to invest in helping Jews around the world, in education, in showing them how the success of French Jewry is in becoming French language, French culture, and the success of the post-emancipatory world for the Jewish community, and therefore they see themselves as somewhat of a vanguard. In 1870, Cremieux scores another success. Algeria, which was a French colony that was considered, as far as the French government was concerned, not a regular colony, but actually French territory. So he succeeds in convincing a law to go through the French Parliament that Algerian Sephardic Jewry should become French citizens, the Cremieux law. And it was a revolutionary moment, because he sees it as the goal to get emancipation for Jewry all over, and here he has an opportunity for Algerian Jewry. Not only that, but if we see them as French, and French Jews can be loyal French citizens, so Algerian Jews can be loyal French citizens. And the Muslims in Algeria do not receive citizenship. So the Algerian Jewry becomes an elite, which causes resentment, which has long-term effects well into the 20th century, to the post-colonial era. The Algerian long war against French colonialism in the 1950s and 60s, and it has big ramifications for the Algerian Jewish community, who are French. Not only that, but it causes, for the French colonists who are Christian, French, and they come and they encounter Algerian Jewry, who they see as not very different from their Muslim neighbors. They say, why are these people privileged to have French citizenship? So both from the colonists, the European colonists, Italian and French colonists primarily, and from the Muslim majority who does not receive French citizenship, this emancipated Jewish community is in an interesting situation. Another stop on the way that I would point out, even though it's not directly related to the Jews, but I find it just very interesting, is a speech by an individual named Ernest Renan. Ernest Renan was a French intellectual of the 19th century, and he non-Jewish, and he's a scholar of Semitic languages and wrote all kinds of books, and a bit of philosopher also. And he gives a speech in 1882 in the Sorbonne in Paris, and the name of the speech is "What is a Nation?" By 1882, there's the rise of the ideals of the revolution have been not abandoned, but the age of liberalism and rationalism and all that has changed in Europe in the spirit of romanticism and modern nationalism, which are connected. And he's grappling with that idea. He's grappling with the idea of nationalism and how it fits in to the liberalist ideals of the revolution. And the name of his speech is "What is a Nation?" And he tries to define it, whereas German philosophers were already at the last quarter of the 20th century defining a nation by objective criteria like race or ethnic groupings. Others were saying religion, those characteristics. And Renan negates those ways of defining the nation, and he formulates a new way of defining what nationalism is that it's the existence of a nation is a daily plebiscite. Those are his words. In other words, a will of the people to continue living together and wanting to do more together. And it's a constant will of the people. And therefore, he comes to the conclusion that nationalism can have a beginning and it can have an end. And he makes a prediction that one day when it ends, it will be replaced by a European confederation of European states. And he says that other bases of nationalism, such as race, such as borders, geographical borders, will lead to untold bloodshed in the next century if you use that as the basis of nationalism, as opposed to my idea that it's a daily plebiscite of the will of the people to continue to work together, irrespective of their background. So again, the Jews aren't mentioned explicitly in the speech, but they're obviously hovering in the shadows, being that they're the ultimate minority in France and in Europe at that time. The next question we want to examine is, does emancipation make anti-Semitism disappear? Again, I'm being very, very general in this episode. There's a lot of details to go into. Perhaps new opportunities will come up to do further episodes on this topic. So we'll go into more details. Does it make anti-Semitism disappear? And it doesn't. In fact, modern anti-Semitism rises and expands. And the disillusionment with emancipation, along with the fact that the majority of the Jewish people in Europe are living in the Tsarist Russian Empire and never receive emancipation, what they're trying to, and it never happens, leads to many to turn inwards towards Jewish nationalism. And Leon Pinsker writes in 1882, auto-emancipation. The emancipation failed, either in Western Europe because it didn't make anti-Semitism disappear, or in Eastern Europe where they never received emancipation. So the Jews have to emancipate themselves and they have to become their own nation. The same thing with Moses Hess. We go back to France. Hess is a Jewish Frenchman, later lives in Germany, and he's a socialist. He's friends with Marx and Friedrich Engels, and he eventually has a fallout with them. But he discovers his Jewish identity, and leads him also to lead to the idea of Jewish nationalism, and he's one of the proto-Zionists of the pre-Zionist era. But in that context of Eastern Europe not receiving emancipation, versus Western Europe where the Jews did receive emancipation, so we have the interesting situation where once the emigration begins from the Russian Empire to other countries, so you have a Russian Jewish community establishing themselves in France and looking for those equal rights, seeking French citizenship. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who lived in Western Europe for most of his later years, he becomes the unofficial rabbi of the Russian Jewish community in France, in Paris, for 2 years, from 1880 to 1882. And he is trying to connect them, trying to see, well, what does emancipation do? What does living in the West do? What does that do to Jewish traditional life? And that's a big question, because traditional life seems to be eroding. There's a interesting rabbi who's the rabbi for many, many years, first in Paris, and then he's the chief rabbi of the French Orthodox Jewish community, Reb Tzadok Khan. And he's actually the last government appointee rabbi, because 2 years after his passing, the French government adopts the separation of church and state, so the rabbi is no longer a government employee. But Reb Tzadok Khan was recognized by the government, and he's definitely a fascinating story of his role in the Alliance, in Zionism, and influencing the Rothschilds to support the settlement in Palestine. And he's actually Dreyfus's rabbi. He was his Masader Kiddushin, so he was very involved in the Dreyfus trial as well, and trying to prove his innocence. And so that's again an expression of a rabbi, an Orthodox traditional rabbi in the post-emancipation world. But what I want to use in the last few minutes is to use the Rothschild family as a prism of what the emancipation means, both as far as the opportunities it gives, as far as an anti-Semitic backlash, as far as what it does to Jewish traditional life. And it's a perfect example because Rothschild became a paradigm of Jewish success. And in theory, it's the success of the emancipation. The Rothschilds originate from Germany and Frankfurt, but they have branches all over Europe, and the French branch becomes a very prominent branch. The shtetl Jews in Eastern Europe used to talk about Rothschild like in the Lakewood coffee room they talk about Rechnitz today. The Lakewood coffee. I recall fondly the one Zman, Elzman I spent in Lakewood. I think I spent more time in the coffee room than I did in the Beis Medrash. It was, I have only positive memories. It was so much fun. It was probably the last time I knew current events, and since then I've been stuck in history. But everything goes down, and everything is discussed and analyzed, and amazing. So shtetl Jews used to talk like that about Rothschild, and we know Shalom Aleichem puts into the mouth of Tuvia the milkman about if I were Rothschild, and the Jewish humor is full of if I were Rothschild, I'd be richer than Rothschild because I'd still be a tailor and make some money on the side, and all kinds of jokes like that. Rothschild became a symbol of the Jewish success. They're the biggest banking family in Europe. They're literally the wealthiest people in the world. Nathan Rothschild in London was the wealthiest person in the world at the time. They receive titles, right? Hereditary titles. They become Vons and Sirs, and from first the Austrian government, later the Queen Victoria bestows it on the English branch, and they're among the European aristocracy. They make it. They have branches in Naples, in Italy, in Paris, in Austria, in Vienna, in Paris, in Frankfurt, which closes down in the next generation because there's no male heirs, and they want to keep it a very strong family business, and they keep it very internal. Everyone tries to marry their first cousins, the first 2-3 generations, till they start assimilating and intermarrying, which is part of what the story is of the Rothschilds, and they are prestige. They become the leadership of the Jewish people. Right, Edmund de Rothschild is the one who supports the first Zionist colonies of the first Aliyah and all kinds of other philanthropic efforts. The one who's the recipient of the Balfour Declaration is Walter Rothschild, who's the natural address. It sent his home address from Lord Balfour. And he's, Walter Rothschild is a member of Parliament himself. His father, Lionel Rothschild, was the first Jewish member of the British Parliament, and the British law had to be changed to allow him to go into Parliament because the oath of office until that time was on a Christian faith, and they actually had to pass a law through British Parliament to change that, to enable Rothschild to take the oath. Like I said, the Frankfurt branch disappears. Eventually, in the 20th century, the Austrian family has to go into exile because the Nazi takeover of Austria in 1938 has them take over all their banks and assets. That's much later, of course. But the French and the English branches of the Rothschild family. Nathan Rothschild, like I said, is the wealthiest person in Europe, in the world. And he financed Duke Wellington in his battles against Napoleon. and and there was all kinds of anti-Semitic myths made up about it, that he took advantage of it, and which Neil Ferguson and others have disproved. But the idea is that his brother-in-law, by the way, was Moses Montefiore, the other wealthy Jew of England at the time. They both married sisters, Cohns, and Nathan Rothschild, his power and his, their banking empire that they created, and finance, and the businesses that they're involved with there in mining and in all the different rising companies. They funded Cecil Rhodes and his African. The Rothschilds were basically responsible for founding the colony of Rhodesia. Today I think it's Zimbabwe. The De Beer diamond company was invested in by the Rothschilds. All the great companies of the 19th century world of industry and finance, high finance, international finance, was the Rothschild. They're the most powerful, banking in the world, involved in the Russo-Japanese War, on the Japanese government side, buying up Japanese war bonds, all kinds of other things. Now, the result of that is that they both, on both sides, they take a leadership position in the Jewish world, but on the other hand, as the generations continue, there's a certain integration, acculturation, even assimilation, even intermarriage, even descendants who aren't Jewish. There's, on the other hand, the Rothschild becomes a stereotype, an anti-Semitic stereotype. There's all types of tropes that there is conspiracy theories. They control the world and they control the governments, and we see it later expressed in Nazi anti-Semitism. In the Nazi documentary, The Eternal Jew, the Rothschilds feature prominently, with even footage taken from a Hollywood film that was about the Rothschilds in 1934, a couple of years earlier. And but even before the Nazis, already in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a Tsarist Russian anti-Semitic invention, in French anti-Semitism, in anti-Semitism of the late 19th century, the Rothschilds are featured as the typical stereotypical Jewish merchant, banker, financier, the modern version of the medieval moneylender, the modern day Shylock. And that's literally how they're presented. So the success of the Emancipation doesn't do away with the anti-Semitism, and it's best expressed through the rise of the Rothschild family. Now, all these subtopics, there's what to expand on, so I hope to have more episodes on this, so be in touch with me about sponsorships of these or other favorite topics, whatever you like. And this was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at Yehuda@yehudageberer.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, virtual tours, lectures, sponsorships. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.